A Hermit in the Himalayas by Brunton. Chapter 7. Early this morning, the sky is a heavenly Wedgwood blue, as clear as the sky of Italy, delicately silvered white by regular streamers of mottled chalky cloud. It is on these clear days that one sees the precipitous massifs of the Himalayas at their very best. Every detail of this glorious landscape becomes lit up by the slanting rays of the young sun, while the vivid light turns the great glaciers of ice into gigantic prisms which reflect back the loveliest fiery welter of colorings. From west to east, one's eye travels along the formidable horizon of jagged peaks and wavy snowfields, a view of such purity and magnificence as to arouse and satisfy the profoundest aesthetic sense. Indeed, the austere purity of the snows would rebuke any intruder who brings a worldly breath with him. The metallic gray crevices which streak the glaciers and the black islands of rock which protrude through the snows gives the needed contrast, and the sky offers a perfect blue background to the entire iridescent scene. I think, by way of contrast, of the green paddy fields of South India, which I know so well, of the picturesque coconut groves, of the dusty plains. I can scarcely gaze out of my back door without feeling a rapturous uplift and exquisite enlivenment. These pyramidal summits, which thrust themselves so majestically above the long white ridge, must make the most town-stupefied man a nature worshipper. They are so grand, so numerous, so resplendent. Dawn, with its pallors, and sunset, with its purples, create pictures that can be watched 1,000 times without any sense of monotony. What though these shining slopes of the Himalaya are often blizzard-swept and avalanche-marked? Their faces possess a perfect beauty. They are the most exquisite productions of the grand architect and the master builder. And yet how jealously these giant ranges of gray ice and bare snow defend the barren black plateau which lies behind the immense magnitude of their perspective. At 15,000 feet, it is the roof of the world. Tibet has lain secure under the fortress-like barriers of the Himalayas for centuries. It seems as if nature has deliberately raised these scores of frigid giants to girdle and guard the land. It holds itself aloof from the rest of the world for very good reasons. But how much longer can it maintain this suspicious seclusion? Applied science and technical invention can conquer even the peaked Himalayas. A cunningly built aeroplane has already nosed its way around and over Mount Everest, the world's highest peak. Consular officer Sir Eric Teichmann's epic flight from Kashgar, Kashgar, in Central Asia to governmental headquarters in New Delhi has shown what 20th century man can do to traverse even the snowy wastes of the Western Himalaya within less than a couple of days. When I visited Hardwar, the ancient town at the mouth of the gorge through which the Ganges enters the plains after cutting its way through the mountains, I received a tremendous surprise. From Hardwar, a path leads into the Himalayas as far as the famous shrine temples of Kedarnath and Badrinath. These places are so closely associated with the Hindu religion that each 100 years of pilgrimage make their way. No, let me start the sentence over again. These places are so closely associated with the Hindu religion that each year hundreds of pilgrims make their way to them on foot, or, if they are well-to-do, in some small, crude palanquin. But this year I found a new means of travel for these pious folk. Some enterprising Hindu engineers had formed a small company and started an air transport line which was already functioning briskly. Wealthier pilgrims were offered seats in a smart little monoplane which covered the distance from Hardwar to the nearest fit landing points in a single hour. From these points, the pilgrims had but a 4-day pony journey to reach the temple of Kedarnath, 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 or a 7-day journey to Badrinath. Yet the poorer folk who toiled their tired way up the mountain path usually took 3 to 4 weeks to cover the same ground. If airplanes are now buzzing into the very heart of the Himalayas and transporting the pious to its sacred shrines, the Arctic barrier cannot remain unscalable much longer. I may yet do my hop in quotes, across the Mount Kailas and start the Buddhist monks in one of 5 monasteries around it, and startle the Buddhist monks in one of 5 monasteries around it with a totally unexpected request for hospitality. Imperiled by petrol plus the brain of man, Tibet's long security may go. Its frozen fastness and lofty strongholds cannot remain untouched in this century. The coming of the airplane may and must bring the sound of whirling propellers across its high tableland and through the very windows of the Potala, Lhasa's great palace. The Everest flight, capital E, capital F, Teichmann's hop, and the pilgrim plane are but the heralds of what is yet to come. Even Ethiopia's conquest is also a portent. Her seclusion was as old as Tibet's, albeit not so harsh, but nearly 3,000 years of reserve and freedom have gone, broken in 7 months. But for the airplane, the Italians would have needed 7 years to conquer those dreary deserts and rocky purple mountains which support the tablelands. Why are these narrow-eyed, high-cheeked Tartans of Tibet so obstinately and keenly and deliberately keen on keeping their frontiers closed? Why do they reinforce nature's majestic mountainous isolation with their own unyielding determination? Why do they cling to such excessive suspicion as tenaciously as the immaculate snows cling to the sides of the ranges that keep guarded watch over their land? The reasons are twofold, religious and material. The rulers of Tibet are the priesthood. The High Lamas are all-powerful. They appoint the sovereign, the Dalai Lama, and compose his council of ministers. They hold the mass of the people within their material and spiritual grip. They know that the coming of foreigners will be fatal to their rule. They regard the foreigner as the barrier of materialism, or alternately as the barrier of a strange religion, both of which are antipathetic to their own faith and consequently dangerous to their own power. They hold his fancied materialism in bitter scorn and do not hesitate to apply the epithet barbarian to the Western intruder, who knows so little of the psychic and religious mysteries, whose secrets are written down in the guarded libraries of the great monasteries. More vital in these matter-of-fact days is the little-known fact that it is probably as much gold within the frontiers of Tibet as within the frontiers of any other country in the world. There may even be a great deal more, for no trained geologist has ever been allowed to make a proper survey of the country's untouched lodes. Even the gold mines which are being worked today under guards of troops lie in a forbidding and most difficult region and are being worked by the most primitive, unscientific methods. The methods which were used 2,500 years ago are still good enough for the modern Tibetans. They are scarcely worthy the name of mining. No one knows with any accuracy how vast are the hoards belonging to the great lamaseries, nor how immense are the lodes of gold lying still unmined in the mountains. There is more than one temple with a roof of solid gold. Will the white faces seek to rifle Tibetan earth of its gold? Will Western avarice remain forever content with being kept out? Far greater than the lamas are the forces which today force East and West together and make the old mingle with the new. Tibet cannot resist successfully the oncoming of the white faces, be it for good or for ill. Already its heads have been reluctantly forced to drop a little of their conservatism and to admit a few of the white man's inventions. Even now the government are putting up a broadcasting station chiefly for the purpose of enabling it to issue orders more quickly to the governors of certain provincial towns. Electric lights glimmer in the palace of Potala, and a telegraph line has linked the capital of Darjeeling in India. When the Tibetan officer interceded on behalf of my Mount Kailas expedition with the authorities at Lhasa, I did not have to kick my heels in New Delhi for 3 weeks, while the yak rider crossed the high passes and a horseman traversed the plateau of southern Tibet to and fro with messages. No, thanks to the Lhasa telegraph line to Darjeeling, I was able to get the final decision through my friend within a few days. It is not in the line of evolution today that East and West must meet, if not marry, although I am somewhat sympathetic to the desires to be left alone of Oriental people who in the past were naturally suspicious of the white man's imperialism. The calendar has moved, and those desires are now antiquated. The whole world is being welded by transport, communications, trade, and culture. I am not of those who foolishly assert that the Western people bring nothing but materialism with them to the East, nothing good. On the contrary, they bring both good and bad, and they find both good and bad. Holiness is not the sole prerogative of the Orient. The latter, I confidently claim, needs a spiritual revival no less than the Occident. Both hemispheres are spiritually in a bad way. And as we are living in a material world, because we possess material bodies, it is right and sensible to make the most of this world, to use all the conveniences, comforts, and inventions which the brain of man can devise. Therefore, the meeting of the progressive West and the conservative East must awaken the latter to exploit and develop the resources of nature more fully. Such a result will not hurt it, only benefit it. The West, too, benefits. The first and obvious benefit is purely material. The second and slower is purely cultural. But let these meetings of different people come about through friendly intercourse. The methods of medieval Spain in opening up Central America and raping her gold will not be admired by the world today. East and West should meet in good fellowship. Let their ideas be exchanged and material improvements brought about by means of mutual cooperation, not by means of the bullet and the bomb. These last words remind me of a significant anecdote which was related to me some years ago by Sir Francis Younghusband. More than 30 years ago, he was placed at the head of a small British military expedition which was sent across the snow-cloaked shoulders of the eastern Himalayas into Tibet to negotiate a political and commercial agreement with the Lama King's government. The main objective of the army's mission was to change the latter's hostile attitude and to compel the Tibetans to adopt a more reasonable view towards the Indian trade. With its entry, Tibet's isolation would begin to leak. Sir Francis gave the Tibetans the fullest opportunity of arriving at a peaceful settlement, but they were obdurate. A hastily gathered army barred his passage on the treeless road to Lhasa. The opposing force was armed only with ancient and rusty matchlock guns, with bows and arrows, and with swords. The British leader knew how childish was this opposition to his well-equipped soldiers with modern rifles, machine guns, and mountain artillery. He therefore requested the Tibetan commanders quite a few times not to resist his advance and be massacred, as he sought only to get a treaty signed, and then he would immediately evacuate Tibet and return to India. But despite their ill-armed and ill-disciplined body of men, the Tibetans would not budge and affected scorn for the enemy, whom at last they attacked. Colonel Younghusband, as he was then, was compelled to give the order to fire, with the result that the withering shells of his artillery poured into the Tibetan ranks, whilst his quick-firing rifles were repeatedly pumping bullets into the enemy, when the latter took a few minutes to reload each wretched, muzzle-loading flintlock musket, with the flint often missing fire. The inevitable occurred. Hundreds of Tibetan soldiers were quickly shot down, and the survivors fled in disarray. The way to Lhasa lay open. The point of the story is that the real reason of the Tibetan army's opposition in the face of a force with such superior weapons lay in its superstition. Its soldiers had trusted to the sorcery of their reputed magicians and to the spells of their famous priests. They had been told that, with the aid of specially prepared amulets and talismans which were freely distributed in their camp, they would be rendered supernaturally invulnerable against the shots of the enemy, and such was their unthinking faith and blind superstition that these poor ill-fated men did attack the British army with complete and complacent confidence that no British bullet would be able to penetrate their bodies. But the laws of nature will not be suspended, not even for any Lama. The episode illustrates the habitual mixture of the ridiculous superstition and profound wisdom which one finds in Oriental races. Yet no people can afford to go on believing in arrogant untruths. The coming of the white races in the East is like a clean, strong wind which blows away the repulsive cobwebs of outworn beliefs and barbarous customs. For the whites bring sanity, common sense, and skepticism. There is room and necessity for these things in life also. Civilization has almost destroyed our faith in the supernatural. Yet let it not be thought that the superstition of the Tibetans is all arrogant nonsense. It is not. There is fire behind the smoke. Truth continues amid the distortions in which we find her engulfed. The Lamas cannot suspend nature's laws, but they can take advantage of laws which to us are unknown. To them, long known. Men with genuine magical powers do exist there, but they are not to be found in the monasteries. Such men always disdain the herd of common monks and take themselves off to isolated places or high up in the mountains, and naturally they are very, very few. They are not at all interested in impressing the masses with displays of their supernormal gifts, but they're boasters and pretenders, the blindly credulous among the orthodox lamas. Even as in India, acquire and keep a hollow reputation for miracle working, which would crumple up with the very first touch of scientific investigation. I have met more than one pretender in India and Africa who offered to provide me with amulets that would make my body bulletproof. Nevertheless, not only is there some residue of truth behind Tibetan claims and Indian claims for the existence of psychic powers and of forces otherwise inexplicable, but there is also something behind the tradition of high spiritual wisdom in the bleak plateau. I believe, from my various researches, that Mount Kailas and its vicinity, including Lake Manarowar, possesses a magnetic atmosphere of intense spiritual vibration, as does Mount Arunachala in South India. I'm going to spell the name of that mountain. Arunachala, Arunachala in South India. I am sure that any genuinely sensitive person would automatically find his thoughts being caught and held in reverence, at least, when he approached this mountain, which is Asia's spiritual center and Tibet's spiritual pride. When the British Army, under Colonel Younghusband's command, did succeed in reaching Lhasa eventually, and the treaty which was the subject of this little war was finally obtained and signed, a curious thing happened to its leader. He told me that the day following this event he obeyed a profound urge and went off alone up the steep rocky hill which overlooks Lhasa. After climbing for some time, he sat down on a boulder and rested. Quickly there came to him the most overwhelming spiritual experience of his life. His whole being was uplifted into a kind of mystic ecstasy. Utter serenity seeped through his soul. There was nothing personal in the experience, for all his desires sank into nothingness before the wonderful, impersonal peace that enveloped him. He came down from that hill with a memorable event engraved on his memory forever. Tibet had given him more than a military conquest. It gave him spiritual illumination. Who or what in that snow-laden land was responsible for the gift? But I must return to my theme. Contact in every way between the Occident and the Orient is inevitable. Tibet cannot lose its high passes against the inflow of Western ideas, but it has had to wait for the 20th century to discover and to disclose this truth. The last forbidden land cannot hold out very much longer. Its fear of Western imperialism is baseless today, although it might have been well grounded 50 years ago. Of the three great powers whose dominions lie nearest to Tibet, England is no longer an annexationist country, but wisely seeks her conquests now through trade. Russia has sufficient land to satisfy her and wants chiefly to concentrate internally on building up her own economic and industrial structure, while China is an empire in a state of sad disintegration. And if the High Lamas fear Western greed for Tibet's rich gold fields, It would be a better business move on their part to lease these fields to European concerns with expert mining engineers, up-to-date scientific equipment, and modern transportation methods at their disposal. In that way, the government would get more profit out of the mines, and the future ownership of the latter would be better safeguarded. Let them also forego the short-sighted political fears and construct a motor road up a Sikkim, Sikkim valley along a river, and the best natural trade route between India and Tibet, and thus save both men and animals the fearful journey over the high snow passes. To keep men always immersed in the doctrines and the doings of the centuries before Christ is not entirely healthy. If the Tibetans were wiser, they would let their brightest young lamas absorb what is useful in Western knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge, and yet insist on holding fast to the essential truths of Buddhist wisdom. The two can easily be made complementary, although not by the narrow-minded orthodox spirits. And while maintaining their strict independence and sovereign authority over their own country, they should mix some common sense and wise discrimination with their rules forbidding the entry of foreigners. On the contrary, if they can get foreigners of the best type and the finest character, or with expert abilities and technical knowledge, to enter their frozen and unattractive land, whose valleys alone are higher than the highest of the Switzerland's peaks, whose bleak plains are shelterless and treeless, and whose length and breadth are swept nightly by Arctic gales, the latter should be made welcome and not driven away. Yet the undesirable troublemakers and the unsympathetic possessors of superior complexes and the unscrupulous exploiters be ruthlessly kept out by all means, but let the country be open to useful Europeans who are sympathetic and sincere well-wishers. It is because I fully believe in the basic truths taught by the Buddha and am therefore sympathetic to every Buddhist people that I always suggest to them the advisability of adapting themselves voluntarily to modern knowledge and modern ways. Thus they can save their ancient wisdom and yet progress with the progressive 20th century. It is not that I suffer from the vanity of time and always imagine that the let me start the sentence over again. It is not that I suffer from the vanity of time, and it is not that I suffer from the vanity of time and always imagine that the substitution of the 20th century for the 17th century is necessarily a substitution of a higher for a lower form of civilization. It is because although our use of scientific inventions is conscienceless, the inventions themselves are not therefore to be despised. But alas, today, the real followers of Buddha are becoming almost as rare in their own lands as the real followers of Christ in Christian lands. That is one reason why the gods are now tearing down the barriers which divide peoples and races and countries. The future is foreseeable in the unified world which shall arise in the welded East-West civilization which is coming to birth. The path will be clear and ready for the message of the universal higher spiritual awakening that is yet to come. No creed exists, but stands in dire need of a fresh impulse of divine life, and it shall come because it must come. A shaven-headed, imperturbable Buddhist monk once told me of an old prophecy which is current in Tibet and is known to the higher lamas, which is curiously appropriate to present conditions. He said that the prediction made 2 or 3 centuries ago concerned the Dalai Lama, or the Grand Lama, Tibet's king and pope combined. It was foretold that the 13th Grand Lama would be the last of his line, and that sometime after his death, Tibet would be thrown open to the white barbarians, whose materialistic civilization would thenceforth penetrate the country. According to the old belief, the next king would be a reincarnation of his spirit. It is the duty of the Grand Council of High Lamas, which is convened to Lama, to find the child in whom the spirit of the deceased priest-ruler is reincarnated. Their theory is not reincarnation in the ordinary sense, but rather that an emanation from a mystic heavenly being, nearly akin to the Buddha, enters into the particular newborn infant, which is destined to become a future Grand Lama. Hence, one of the titles of the latter is, quote, the all-knowing, end quote, as he is presumed to possess divine knowledge. The Grand Council always consult the state oracle when it has to find guidance in the search for the child. After finding a number of male infants bearing certain traditional signs, it orders their names to be inscribed on tablets, which are placed in a golden urn, and the one thus drawn out by lot is selected. After it finds the boy, he has to be educated and prepared for his high office. That means about 15 to 20 years must pass before the child reaches maturity and real rulership. Meanwhile, the country is governed by the Council of Regents. I do not remember the name of this particular native prophet who foretold the disappearance of the Grand Lamas and the entry into Tibet of the whites. I believe, however, that part of it will be fulfilled, and that this sealed country will be thrown open eventually and will suffer the impact and inevitable influence of the forces of the new era, whatever they may be. And that concludes chapter 7. And isn't it interesting when you listen to his thoughts on what's to come and what we know now has passed in the world with regard to China rebuilding itself, like completely reinventing itself over the last couple of decades, and Russia now at war, and Tibet having been overtaken, and oh my goodness, I mean, everything's just changed. Anyhow, that concludes chapter 7. And chapter 8, the subtitles are A Correspondent Decries My Retreat from the World, The Virtues of Idleness and Solitude, My Religion, the New Testament, Jesus and His Critics. Well, that sounds interesting. So I hope you're enjoying this. I'm finding it most interesting. Paul Brunton writes very well and is most astute in his observations. So till soon.